Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Progressive International Forum for Peace. I'm Varsha Gandikota-Nalitla, joining you from the Progressive International Cabinet, and I'm honored to have as my co-chair Amar Ali Jan, who is on our council and is joining us from Pakistan. Hi, Amar.
Hi, everyone.
We're bringing this forum to you today amidst an escalating war in Ukraine. We're closer to nuclear war than between the two largest nuclear states than at any other time in over a generation. What it feels like is a series of mistakes, any accidents, any misunderstandings could lead to the obliteration of millions of people, both in Ukraine and lives far away from the region. So last week, the Cabinet of the Progressive International held an emergency meeting in response to the war and the escalating tensions in Ukraine. And I'd like to read out that statement to begin today's forum. War is a crime. We stand with the victims of the Putin government's brutal invasion in Ukraine and with the people in Russia suffering from a war that the people did not choose. We call on progressive forces to push for an immediate diplomatic solution that protects all refugees, guarantees the universal right to self-determination, and moves to dismantle all military-industrial alliances like NATO that endanger peace across the world. I know that for some of us, this war feels new. For some of us, it's been the only reality that's existed. War is now shattering lives in Ukraine, as it has been in many parts of the world. Amar and I live on either sides of one such conflict in Kashmir that I've grown up reading about. But of course, we have the luxury of relative safety where we live in India and in Pakistan. From the NATO wars in Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq, and the Saudi-led bombing of Yemen, to the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and even the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. The tragedy of conflict is often hidden and sanitized. So as our leaders, beat the drums of war, those of us, internationalists, those on the left, those on the side of innocent people, we only have one historical role to play: to build a new global anti-war movement. So our most critical task today in this forum and in the world in this critical moment is to dismantle the war machine wherever it exists and replace it with a diplomacy of peoples based on cooperation and coexistence. And that is the principle that's enshrined in the Declaration of the Progressive International as well. So today's forum brings together anti-war activists from around the world who we want to listen to, and not just listen in the abstract sense of why war is bad, but really pay attention to the horrors of war, to the many immediate and lasting ways in which violence becomes part of our bloodstream. So with that, I give the floor to my terrific co-chair, Amar.
Thank you so much, Varsha. First of all, I'd like to begin with solidarity to all victims of the war in Ukraine. Russia has been rightly condemned for its aggression in Ukraine. At the same time, those of us in the global south are demanding a widening of the debate to include the injustices faced by people in our part of the world. For example, here in Pakistan, it is very difficult to take claims of the West of being a defender of human rights seriously. Pakistan and Afghanistan have borne the brunt of America's war on terror, including the clandestine and illegal drone warfare that terrorized large sections of the population. Incidentally, the US has also been the prime supporter of military dictatorships in Pakistan, giving financial and military aid to repressive regimes as part of its anti-communist strategy during the Cold War. This history has not just been experienced in Pakistan, but also across the world, particularly in the Middle East, where America's wars have destroyed countries such as Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, while ignoring the ongoing genocide in Palestine. Similarly, military dictatorships from Latin America to Africa to the Muslim world have received support from the US. Perhaps one of the worst examples is the coup in Indonesia orchestrated by the CIA in 1965 that led to the killing of almost 1 million people by the military junta. Therefore, today, the political choices on the global horizon are blurred as Russia displays belligerence against a neighboring country and is being challenged by a Western alliance that has cared little for human rights or democracy when it comes to its own strategic interests. The fear is that the cost of these rivalries will once again be borne by people in the global south. In order to develop a nuanced political position on this crisis, we are convening this panel of experts to not only shed light on the situation, but also to propose a global strategic horizon to defeat the forces of imperialism, militarism, and chauvinism. With this, it is an honor for me and Russia to open the Peace Forum.
We'd hoped to begin this forum with a testimony from our friend Vladimir Dyshenko from Ukraine, and we just learned that he had to withdraw at the last moment given the humanitarian crisis sweeping Ukraine at the moment. That once again brings home for me and for everyone I know at Progressive International the horrors of this war. So in his stead, I want to bring a few of Vladimir's words to you today. In a publication from a few days ago, Vladimir says, "It feels like the country where I was born may be lost forever. Russia's invasion of Ukraine looks like the culmination of a process that started on November 30th, 2013, with the brutal crackdown by the riot police on the Euromaidan protesters in Kiev. From that moment, I increasingly felt that things were developing from bad to worse." This is only the beginning of an excerpt of what is a harrowing testimony from Vladimir about the state of things affairs in Ukraine today. You can read more about his work at the link in the chat. Vladimir Dyshenko is a research fellow at the Institute of Slavic Studies in the Technical University of Dresden, and his research is focused on a variety of things on protests, social movements, revolutions, and right and left-wing politics, nationalism, civil society in Ukraine. Our solidarity and love to you, Vladimir. So to open the forum then, I want to turn to our next speaker, invite Alexei Sakhnin. Alexei is a Russian activist and an anti-war organizer. He was one of the leaders of the anti-Putin protest movement from 2011 to 13, and he was later exiled to Sweden before returning to Moscow, from where he joins us today. Over to you, Alexei.
Dear friends and comrades, my name is Alexei Sakhnin, and I'm the member of Coalition Socialist in the War. I'm in Moscow, and today is 3rd of March. It's very difficult to explain how we are feeling here, because the worst what could happen already had happened. We are living under the war. This war have a concrete name, and it's Vladimir Putin. It was him who ordered Russian soldiers and officers die and kill our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Neither geopolitics, neither propagandistic hysteria over Ukrainian nationalism could not explain reasons of the bloody war. All geopolitical challenges and threats against Russia just grew up in many times. Ukrainian nationalists, they got a huge excuse for all those crimes. And now Ukrainian society have to unite on the right-wing patriotic and even nationalistic platform, and how to condemn them. It's just one reason why Putin started that bloody war. He wants to keep his power over Russia forever. He wants to make all ruling class, to unite Russian ruling class on the criminal platform of the war, to make his personal fate the same what is the common fate of Russian ruling class. His dream is to make Russian fate the prisoner of his own life. But that is a lie. That is not true. Our people does not want this war. This war is not fair war. That war is criminal, bloody, and have no any moral explanation. It would be we, the poor majority, the working class, who would pay for that criminal war with poverty, with inflation, with unemployment, and with blood of our children. It's very difficult and scary to resist, to protest. Russia is already transformed to the real prison. If I just call that war, I can get 15 years of prison. It's already 6,000 people are sitting arrested for protests, for street protests. But we have no place to retreat. We socialists, we people of democratic views, we have to cross our fear to show that it's not war of the Russian people. It's a war of a military criminal, Vladimir Putin. And you know, that's why we have to ask about your solidarity. We really need your solidarity, because the only one important argument of propaganda is that Russia is alone against all the world. That all the world want to conquer and divide Russia into small parts. We should show that millions of the people are on the same side with us in the struggle against dictatorship and wars. We need your solidarity, anti-imperialistic, anti-war movement in all over the world. And the last thing. This war have named Vladimir Putin, but he was not alone. It was all 30 years of post-Soviet era which led us to that catastrophe. It was inequality which made Russia dictatorship, because people just lose their voice. It was all regimes in post-Soviet countries use the shameful nationalistic rhetoric to legitimize their rule. Now we're just in the logical end of their society of inequality and exploitation. Now it's very clear for us that to conquer peace we have to just change the world. And as Parisians in 1789, our slogan is simple. Égalité, liberté, fraternité. No to war.
It's really incredible to hear from Alexei from Moscow, because today we look to Moscow both with dread and with hope, where young men are conscripted to fight against their wishes, with thousands of anti-war protesters are out on the street and are risking being arrested as Russia's cities and its civic spaces are being shut down. I want to talk about Irina Shimilova, an activist of Left Bloc, who's one of our member organizations at Progressive International, who was fined earlier this week under Russia's new wartime censorship laws for organizing a solo picket with a poster that read, "This war is funded by your taxes while we crowdfunded for children's healthcare." So Alexei, thank you for those brave words. And I can only imagine the risk that you're taking to bring your testimony to us today. Our next speaker is Yara Hawari, who is a Palestinian activist, academic, and political analyst. She received her PhD in Middle East politics from the University of Exeter in 2018, and she currently works as a senior analyst for Al-Shabaka, a Palestinian transnational think tank, and is a frequent political commentator for many mainstream outlets. The floor is yours, Yara.
The war will end, the leaders will shake hands. The old woman will keep waiting for her martyred son. That girl will wait for her beloved husband, and those children will wait for their hero father. I don't know who sold our homeland, but I saw who paid the price. This is a poem that has gone viral on social media over the last few weeks. Few know that it was written by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. And indeed, the Palestinian people know the horrors of war well. We know invasion, displacement, destruction. We know what it's like to leave homes, to have to make the choice between exile or bombs raining down upon our heads. We know who pays the price of political games, proxy wars, and imperial interventions. We and many others in the Global South know it all well. We also know well misleading and dehumanizing narratives. And over the past few weeks, we have seen an abundance of these by the mainstream Western media. As masses of Ukrainians have fled their homes in the hope of shelter and safety, we have seen pundits and journalists alike asking, how can this happen? This is Europe, it's civilized. Void of any context that has led to this moment, and as if Europe and the US are above violence and war, despite the fact that they have invaded and brought terror to nearly every corner of the globe. And we have also heard from these people, these are not refugees from the Middle East or Africa, as if refugees from the Middle East and Africa are less worthy of refuge and safety, as if their lives are less grievable. As the media continues to propagate dehumanizing discourses and offer political analysis void of nuance and context, and as world leaders continue to bang the drums of war, internationalists everywhere must take a stand against all colonial wars, invasions of territories, and fascism. Importantly, we must also remember that imperialism, capitalism, militarism work together as part of the same violent machine that oppresses people all over the world. This is the time to come together, because indeed the people united will never be defeated.
Thank you, Dr. Yara, for your testimony. You've rightly pointed out that what a lot of us in the global South have felt over the past few weeks, both solidarity for the victims of the war in Ukraine, but also the glaring double standards in the Western media. And it's difficult not to think about people from the Middle East, from the Muslim world, from Latin America, immigrants and refugees whose dignity was denied by the same Western powers. And of course, you are speaking from Palestine, which is both a site of extreme oppression, but also a symbol of resistance that continues to inspire people all over the world. So thank you so much for your testimony and for your work that you do in Palestine and around the world. Our next speaker is Pierre Sané. Pierre Sané is the founder and president of Imagine Africa Institute and was UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences from May 2001 to June 2010. He was also the General Secretary of Amnesty International from October 1992 to April 2001. It's an honor for us to have Pierre Sané with us. Over to you, Pierre.
My dear friends, my dear comrades, this is a message from Pierre Sané. I am the president of the Imagine Africa Institute, and I am a member of the cabinet of Progressive International. This is a message about Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine, it is a plea that I am sending to the African governments, to the African political parties, to the African progressives, to the African activists, and it is a plea for neutrality. But before I address Ukraine, let me say a few words about Mali, because I was in Mali 2 weeks ago, and because of what I have seen in Mali in terms of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is tearing apart the last bits of trust between the African people and Western government. In Mali, the European armies who deployed to fight their war against global terrorism have decided unilaterally to withdraw from Mali because of the arrival of quote unquote Russian mercenaries. They say it is a breach of international law, a breach of the Convention on the Use and Deployment of Mercenaries. Fair enough. But last week, here in Dakar, Senegal, the ambassador of Ukraine was reprimanded by the Minister of Foreign Affairs because he had launched a Facebook page to recruit what he calls volunteers to go and fight against the Russian army in Ukraine. Before the post was taken down, 36 Senegalese had registered to go and fight in Ukraine. 200 had registered in Côte d'Ivoire, where the registration was done underground. And we are told 16,000 foreign mercenaries are fighting in Ukraine at the moment. So bad mercenaries, good mercenaries, we believe that what is undermining international law is bad faith, and bad faith in broad daylight. We think that you cannot secure an international rule of law if bad faith is considered as a fair move. And NATO today is the embodiment of international bad faith. We all ask the question, since NATO has defeated the communist camp, why keep NATO? NATO for what? NATO for how long? And after Russia, who will be next? And if a new Russia is integrated into NATO, then what will be the purpose of NATO? Once all the white people have been integrated into a solid, powerful military alliance, what will this alliance be tasked with? Many of us will not condemn Vladimir Putin for launching what he calls a special operation because we do not trust NATO and because we have been witnesses to what NATO has done in just the past 20 years, from Iraq to Libya. So Ukraine, yes, Ukraine, we all cry for Ukraine. We are in an era of endless outrage. Serbia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, Syria, Yemen, Mali, and now Ukraine. However, this unending suffering must not dampen our outrage, because with each and all of these tragedies, we feel for the victims and we stand in solidarity with the people. But with each and all of these aggressions and invasions and sanctions, we worry about the viability of international law and the future of international institutions, where international law is so blatantly violated in total impunity by the big players of this world. We in Africa acknowledge that we are not among the big players, at least not for now. We are marginal players in this bloody world power game. This is why we Africans should stand aside and stay neutral, not taking side. For 5 centuries, we have been the pawns into the hands of the warring European states, bent on looting Africa from its human resources and its natural resources, with all the accompanying destructions, violence being visited on African societies. Should this war in Ukraine escalate, we say, and we say it loud, don't bring it to our shores. Neutrality doesn't mean indifference. Neutrality means continuously calling for the respect of international laws. Neutrality means that our hearts still go to the victims of military invasions and victims of arbitrary sanctions never imposed on NATO countries. And neutrality means keeping away from the battlefields. At independence, African countries were forced to sign defense pacts, secret defense pacts, undisclosed to this day, including to our parliaments. And those pacts are said to include a clause whereby should France get involved in military adventure at the international level, we will be bound to provide it with troops like we did during the 2 world wars, the war in Vietnam and the war in Algeria. If true, it should be immediately denounced, like Mali did 2 months ago, using, if necessary, the International Court of Justice. These treaties include also the maintenance of the French colonial currency, the forcible use of French language as our official language in education, culture, law, and administration, the preferential access to our national resources and markets, and the deployment of French military bases on our territories. Progressive international lawyers should liaise and help us in getting rid of these illegal, illegitimate, and archaic treaties. We do not want to be involved in these European wars and imperialist adventures, in spite of the relentless propaganda and diplomatic pressure on African countries to take side publicly. We have given enough of our blood. Neutrality is the only option for us. We call again and again on French troops to leave our soil and to go away. Leave us alone. We will not serve as suppletives in the future. That is my message. Our priority is to end colonialism because it is still alive, it is still kicking, and it is still deadly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pierre Sané, and thank you for mentioning how people in the global south, in the colonized world, have been used as cannon fodder in European conflicts. We come from the subcontinent, and soldiers and young people were recruited into the British Indian Army to fight in both the First and the Second World Wars. And they were told that they're fighting for freedom, but at the same time, that freedom was denied at home due to a colonial policy and a concept of racial hierarchies. Unfortunately, people from the global south have been used as proxies during the Cold War. And now, as you rightly pointed out, there's danger that we will be pushed into a conflict that we neither caused nor do we have stakes in it. And I think it's important to have a very principled, anti-war, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist position. This brings me to our next speaker, Natasha Cole. Ms. Natasha Cole is a multidisciplinary academic, novelist, poet, artist, and economist from Kashmir, India. She's currently an associate professor in politics and international relations at the Center for the Study of Democracy, University of Westminster in London. And I would like to say here that coming from the subcontinent, Kashmir has a special place because the people of Kashmir have been denied their rights, have fought one of the longest battles of national liberation, and have endured the worst forms of human rights violations. And it's truly an honor for us to hear from Natasha Cole, to get a perspective from Kashmir on what conflict and war means in the contemporary world. So over to Ms. Natasha Cole.
Thank you to the organizers for doing this. My name is Natasha, and I would like to offer a few comments here at this crucial juncture. So when we think about the current situation in Ukraine and in Russia, it is very tempting, and often the media has been framing it as a sort of morality tale. I implore upon you all and more of us to reject this morality tale framing, because war is not the answer. It's never the answer. What we must strive for is peace and justice. This is really an urgent task that faces all of us anywhere who have experiences of oppression, either lived experiences or experiences of work on oppression. What we see in the Ukrainian case, of course, is a territorial conflict. It's a conflict that is fast escalating, and it has all the hallmarks of a conflict that can get entrenched, because it is a conflict, as the literature shows us, about territory. It is between rivals. And in such kinds of conflicts, the length of time matters. So the longer that this goes on, the more likely it is that the positions get hardened and entrenched, and diplomacy becomes much harder. So we have to move beyond the simplistic framings to try and accept the situation as it currently is, and to see what the ways out of it are. And in that context, I would like to offer a few remarks. So firstly, I want to say that it's really important not to confuse peace with appeasement, diplomacy with appeasement. War is a failure, not diplomacy. What is really important here is to not oversimplify history. Even when we look back to the interwar history, people often oversimplify and say, oh, well, the alternative was appeasement to Hitler. That really wasn't. Even the people who were, so archival research tells us that even the people who were talking about peace at that time, even there were people who would have preferred appeasement, but there were people who thought of justice as being important. So it is always possible to find these ways, and we can only find these ways through negotiation, diplomacy, and reconciliations involving history and memory. And all of that is hard work, but it's better than the bombs that are raining down on people and the global cascades of misery that are going to be set in motion as a result of what's going on right now. So I want to say that it's really important, therefore, right now, to be aware of the ways in which militarism, masculinity, misogyny, and nationalism are combining to create territorial fixations and escalating these conflicts. It's also important to remember the strategic hypocrisy on things relating to sovereignty and self-determination. There are peoples around the globe who have seen this, peoples in the so-called third world, the formerly colonized parts of the world, who feel strongly about it, because we have witnessed all of those wars and we have seen the entrenched conflicts. And it is really important to keep that in mind too, and to distance ourselves from the pernicious nationalisms that legitimize oppressions in their name, as important as it is, of course, to denounce invasions and to denounce authoritarians who do not care for the miseries they inflict upon their own populations. What has been especially disturbing over the last few weeks is to see the selective humanity of the refugees, where various kinds of racisms have been normalized so that it is seen as very unusual for a civilized people somehow to be facing this, when in fact, the longer history of that civilization has left a little, a trail of dead bodies globally through various kinds of enslavements and colonizations, and to not refer to this as some kind of a return to history. It is also important to recognize the virtue signaling of corporate companies that seek to ban admissions or movies or whatever from Russia for what they are, simply virtue signaling. We must not slip into a discourse of competing victimhoods, but at the same time, we must be aware of the kinds of real and contrived grievances that can be manufactured by authoritarians who weaponize an anti-Western sentiment, at the same time as we recognize the hypocrisies that have been carried out in the name of democracy and freedom by the West. So it is important to be aware of both sides of this situation, in fact, to be aware of all of these sides. In my own work, I've referred to this kind of use of humiliation and a weaponization of the past as the moral wound. And this it works in ways that are used to silence and shut down human rights talk as being somehow Western, as rights and justice and democracy talk as being Western, while at the same time laying claim to a anti-colonial history that is also about human rights. So there are various contradictions in the ways in which this anti-West sentiment is weaponized, and it is important to be aware of all of that. At this point at this juncture in world history, we face a serious risk of escalation between and possibly the involvement of nuclear armed states. We've been here before, and it's a terrible situation. I mean, speaking as someone who has written and worked on Kashmir for a very long time and is Kashmiri herself, I just want to quote something that I've said before, which is that we must find ways of addressing the rights and aspirations of populations in the absence of spectacular violent incidents that bring regions to the brink of nuclear war. Otherwise, what sort of incentives do we set up if we let these problems fester and then only attend to them once they get to this point? The really radical thing here is, of course, to do the dialogues of history and memory in internationally supported, credible, non-partisan spaces so that we can find the ways forward to pave the way for mutually just reconciliations that respect people's rights, responsibilities, and freedoms. It is always possible to find a way that does not feed off literally the blood and misery of people who will die and who will suffer as a result of the cascading economic misery globally, including some of the most marginalized peoples in the global south. At the same time as the military-industrial complex will get enriched. We have already seen reports that the stocks of, the war stocks of Lockheed Martin, of Northrop, etc., have gone up by 20%. And this is at the same time as the poor will find it harder and harder anywhere to be able to just afford fuel, and the knock-on contexts, the effects of all of that across a range of things that people need for their subsistence and livelihoods, not to mention what the Ukrainians themselves will be facing, which is in Ukraine, which is, of course, the horrors of an invasion that can become more and more entrenched and draw more actors globally into it, and become even more complex and multi-state and harder to even make any move forward on. Therefore, I just want to close this by saying that we need to be aware of the fact that real solidarity does not look like condoning authoritarian territorial invasions, and it does not also look like condoning nationalist warmongering and bandwagoning and the hounding actually of academics, including of realists and others. We must respect that there are a plurality of views, but at the same time, it is not hard. It is the easiest and most rational thing to be able to see here that what is needed, what can de-escalate the situation, is diplomacy, dialogue, and thinking towards peace rather than a hardening of positions and a lack of understanding of the global effects of all of this. I would like to just quote from a Renoir movie that the awful thing about life is this, that everyone has their reasons. And as we see in conflicts too, denouncing other actors are irrational or insane is not the answer. The important thing to understand here is that there are competing narratives of rationality and reason that are at work here on all sides. And the only way to be both sensible as well as acting from a moral conscience is to be able to extend solidarity to those who are suffering now, and to be able to understand the hypocrisies that have led to this point, and the need not to escalate this further in the interests of the war machine, but to actually move towards peace and greater understanding that can help with this situation, urgent as it is. Thank you.
Natasha, thank you for joining us today. As you were speaking, I kept remembering Shehnaz Bashir's book, Half Mother. Half Mother is a term that women in Kashmir have chosen for themselves, not only because they're subject to state-sponsored violence that leads to kidnapping, killing, and forced disappearance of their husbands, brothers, and family members, but also because they're not given any information about this at all, rendering them essentially to a life full of waiting. They call themselves half mother because they don't know where their children are. And as we think about the many different ways in which war enters our lives, our homes, our food, I want to turn now to Guam, a region where endless militarization is threatening its ecosystem and many of its important cultural and historical sites. Julian Aguan is a human rights lawyer and a founder of Blue Ocean Law, a progressive firm working across Oceania at the intersection of indigenous rights and environmental justice. In a beautiful essay called No Country for 8-Spot Butterflies, Julian, who also sits on the cabinet of the Progressive International and is a dear friend, he heart-wrenchingly asks, if only superpowers were concerned with the stuff of lowercase earth, like forests and freshwater, if only they were moved by beauty. So over to you, Julian, to hear more about Guam.
Half a day and greetings from Guam. My name is Julian Uggan, and I'm a council member of the Progressive International, and it's an honor to be here with you all today for this International Forum for Peace. In Guam, every manner of war game is afoot. As I write this, the noise of helicopters flying far too low and close to my home is making it hard to hear my husband, who is in the kitchen cooking dinner. The vibration is making my heart race and a glass of water tremble on the table. The sun is setting and the sky is turning an impossible orange, but all I see is red. I am angry. I am worried each day more than the last that this is the new normal. Last month, it was the noise of fighter jets that filled the air. For weeks, they screeched across the sky for hours as the air forces of Japan, Australia, and the US descended on Guam for Operation Cope North, a series of aerial combat training exercises involving 130 aircraft from the 3 countries, with 8 other countries participating as observers. It was 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was sitting with a friend who owns a small cafe. We were catching up over coffee when we heard the first round of jets. We were 2 feet apart and screaming to hear each other. The month before that, it was Operation Sea Dragon, whereby the combined forces of Australia, Canada, India, Japan, and Korea deployed to Guam for anti-submarine warfare training. All told, 6 such exercises will happen here before summer's end, culminating in the biggest among them, Operation Valiant Shield. To give you a sense of the scale of this single exercise, during a previous Valiant Shield, over 20,000 U.S. military personnel, 280 aircraft, and 30 ships partook in the games. To give you a sense of what this means on the ground, that weekend water was cut off to a number of local villages, and the people of those villages went some 30 days without running water. To be clear, my people are under siege. The United States is steamrolling over our right to self-determination in its rush to expand its military footprint on Guam. It's building a brand new Marine Corps base and bringing thousands of U.S. Marines from Okinawa. It's constructing a massive live-fire training range complex in an area that we consider sacred. In the process, it is destroying thousands of acres of limestone forest and endangering a whole host of other than human life. Once these firing ranges are operational, our healers will be denied access to the jungles where they've gathered the plants needed to make our medicine since time immemorial. Our fishermen, too, will be denied access to the surrounding waters for most of the year, thereby losing not only an important cultural practice, but the ability to feed their families. Just the other day, a bomber, or what looked like a bomber, flew into the bay, where families were picnicking, where children were playing. I cannot describe the rage one feels when one is forced to overhear a young mother reaching for the language to explain to her child what a bomber is and why it is here, and how it is making her heart race. I share this because I am trying to show you, not tell you, what it looks like to live in a militarized colony. I share this because we in the anti-war movement need to start using all of our senses. And finally, because for whatever our differences, we are all being gaslighted by the same lie, that we cannot direct our moral outrage at more than one party at once. We can and we must. Last week, members of the PI cabinet, of which I am a member, released a statement regarding the escalating war in Ukraine, making clear our position that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was and remains illegal, illegitimate, and utterly terrifying for its victims in Ukraine and across Europe. This statement called on progressive forces to push for an immediate diplomatic solution, not to escalate this war, not to drive up defense spending, and certainly not to rally around the flag of NATO, or any flag for that matter. Our vision, as set out in the founding declaration of the PI, is to dismantle the war machine everywhere and to replace it with the diplomacy of peoples. That is why we are here today, to choose to see the world in a light other than what the establishment has shown. to choose each other, to choose, even at a distance, to hold hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for drawing our attention to the whisper and scurry of small lives, as Arundhati Roy, who I know you and I both love, once so beautifully put it. The orange sky that you spoke about has been a constant reality in another part of the world that has also been struggling to gain some space in the global imagination, in the mainstream media landscape. It's Yemen. And so to turn there, I'm so honored to invite Aisha Juman, who is the founder and president of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation and has over 30 years of experience in public health and women in development and maternal health. And she's now also served on the faculty of Emory University as well as Sanaz University. Aisha, I know you're currently coordinating health projects in Yemen, so I'm so grateful that you took the time to join us today. Over to you.
Juman. I'm the president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and I'm an epidemiologist by training. I manage health projects in Yemen. I'm pleased to be with you today, and I want to thank the Forum for Peace for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be talking today about the war on Yemen and the ongoing role of the U.S. through 3 presidents, 2015 to present. I'll start by talking about the air raids, the Saudi air raids and the blockade on Yemen. This is from the Yemen Data Project and shows the Saudi Yemen Air Raids timeline per month. And you can see in 2015, there were a lot of air raids in Yemen, and then they started declining over time. However, unfortunately, by the end of 2021, we saw an increase. And January of this year, 2022, was very devastating and with large number of casualties and airstrikes. How did this increase in airstrikes happen? There were 2, I think, elements that contributed to that. One is the Saudi used incentives and threats to shut down UN investigation of war crimes in Yemen, and that occurred in October of 2021. The second part is the Saudi got their first major deal under Biden with air-to-air missiles, so they basically got a green light to continue their airstrikes in Yemen. This is the result of, in January 2022, where it's more than 60 killed, including children, airstrikes in Yemen. Actually, the total number was over 90, with 3 children in Hodeidah and over 90 deaths in a detention center in Sada, a temporary detention center in Sada. I also want to talk about the blockade. This is the United Nations Verification Inspection Mechanism for 2021, and it shows food and fuel imports in Yemen. Food import is in blue and fuel import is in red here. And as you can see, the number of items that are available are coming through the port of Hodeidah, especially, are a lot less than what Yemen needs, both in terms of food and also in terms of fuel. In terms of fuel, they almost get nothing in 2021. And in terms of the food import, they should be getting almost like 600,000 tons, but they're not getting that. So they're not getting enough food nor fuel. And as we know, fuel is crucial to everything in life. This is another slide from the UN verification system, and you can see here in 2016 there were about 40,000 vessels that entered the Hodeidah port. By 2021, only 1,634 vessels were allowed to go in, and that just shows you the decline, the huge decline in what's allowed to get in Yemen. Basically, it's a siege, all a blockade imposed on the largest port in Yemen. As a result, we've had a huge number of deaths in Yemen. This is from a UN report saying that at least 377,000 by the end of 2021 would have been killed or died. 70% of those are children, and 60% of these deaths are due to indirect causes such as lack of safe water, hunger, and disease. And as an epidemiologist, I can tell you this is a huge underestimate. The real number will at least be 1 million. In terms of the impact of the war on the population, Yemen is considered the largest humanitarian crisis with 24 million people who are in need. Of these, 14.4 million are in acute need. We have over 4 million Yemeni people who are displaced. 80% have been displaced for over a year, and almost also 80% of those who are displaced are women and children. Over 16 million people are food insecure, and 15 million people in Yemen, half of them are children, don't have access to safe water, sanitation, or hygiene. In terms of the impact of the war on health in Yemen, we've seen a huge increase in morbidity and mortality. We've seen a damage to infrastructure leading to increased risk of infectious diseases outbreaks. Yemen experienced the largest recorded cholera outbreak in the world. We've seen also weakened health system, shortages of medical supplies, including medications for chronic diseases, dialysis, and chemotherapy. Fuel shortages, reducing hours of operations in the health system or closing facilities, especially in the rural areas, and collapsed economy in Yemen due to the blockade on Yemen, and then saw a huge risk, increased risk of famine. I will go over some slides that shows a lot of the airstrikes that have impacted civilians and are considered war crimes, and what has the response been from the US administration, whether in 2015 like this one, or under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, and under the Obama administration. So we all know that the war started under the Obama administration. He gave the green light to the Saudis start the war. And the war was actually announced from Washington, D.C., not from Riyadh. So this was a huge bomb that was dropped on Yemen. There was a huge devastation. Initial report says 25 died, but the number was a lot larger than that. And the destruction that occurred in that area and the neighborhood were huge. This is from 2016. It's at least 16 dead after Saudi-led coalition bombed Yemen hospital. Several hospitals in Yemen were bombed, including at least four that were MSF or Doctor Without Borders hospitals. This is again from Human Rights Watch saying Yemen Saudi-led funeral attack, apparent war crimes. The Saudi-led coalition attacked a funeral home, killing at least 100 people and wounding over 500 people. This is from the Washington Post. Again, in 2018, it says US allies have killed thousands of Yemeni civilians from the air. After 22 die at a wedding, one village asks, why us? And the Saudi-led coalition have bombed multiple weddings. Bomb into famine, how Saudi air campaign targets Yemen's food supply. So in addition to the blockade, they also target food centers in Yemen, hoping for a famine, I'm sure. US supplied bomb that killed 40 children on Yemen's school bus. This was, many of these kids were less than 10 years of age. They're at an average of 12 attacks a day. This is continuous for 6 years, and we're now entering our 8th year. They also, in 2019, hit a detention center, killing and wounding at least 200 people. So in January 2022, when they hit a detention center, that was not their first targeting of detention centers. This says, again, from Ned Price, State Department spokesperson, saying, we condemn the overnight attacks by the Houthi on the UAE and Saudi Arabia. These attacks, as well as the recent airstrikes in Yemen, represent troubling escalation that only exacerbates the suffering of the Yemeni people. So notice that we condemn the overnight attacks by the Houthis on UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are like 1 in a million of what the Saudis are doing in Yemen, yet there is no condemnation of the Saudi and the Emirati airstrikes in Yemen. This goes, these attacks as well as the recent airstrikes in Yemen. So there is no condemnation on the Saudi or the UAE attacks on the Yemeni people. This is an article by Trita Parsi, January 2022. Biden is enabling America's indefensible history with Saudi Arabia. And he also says here that the Biden administration had condemned the Houthis 14 times through the State Department. Yet Biden has a perfect record of never condemning Saudi Arabia. And that is not just with Biden. We also saw the similar behavior from Presidents Trump and Obama. This is Secretary Blinken on the recent attacks on the Ukraine, Russian attack on the Ukraine. He says, if we allow the rules of the international order to be flagrantly trampled anywhere, we weaken them everywhere. We must condemn firmly and equivocally Russians' attempt to topple a democratically elected government, and so on. And he goes to talk about human rights abuses and violations. This is ironic, given that the U.S. is aiding the Saudi in their war on Yemen for 7 years now, and we never heard a language on the Yemen war that resembles this. So here is one response to that tweet. It says, considering how the Saudi-led coalition has been destroying Yemen for years with bombs made by the U.S. and others, Blinken's tweet seems totally unreal. I'm all for securing peace in Ukraine, but U.S. hypocrisy really is something else. Biden promised to end the war on Yemen. This is from India Today. It's beyond Ukraine, a devastating war in Yemen not many are talking about. So the Yemen war is ignored on purpose because the U.S. is involved in it and a U.S. partner is doing all the war crimes. Here is someone laminating on what's happening recently. He said, sorry, these pictures below aren't from the Ukraine. These are from Yemen, with a war that's not reported by the media in your country. So this is a cartoon that I think summarizes very well how many of us feel. This is Yemen, and the Yemeni people have decided to use the Ukrainian flag so they can get attention to the atrocity committed against them. It says, now they will see us. So there is an attempt to have a war power resolution. Representatives Jayapal and DeFazio have written in the Nation in February of 2022 why we intend to pass a new Yemen war power resolution. Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Aisha. This was very illuminating and heartbreaking. I think it is an absolute shame that this horrific human rights violation, this form of terror that has been imposed by the US and Saudi Arabia on the Yemenis people has not received the adequate attention in the global media. And I think your testimony has been very useful in telling people the scale of the human disaster that we're witnessing in Yemen. And I really hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation on Yemen, because Yemen really is one of the central sites for thinking about the forms of militarism and imperialism that the world faces today, and particularly from those who claim today to be defenders of human rights and democracy. So thank you so much for your testimony. Our next speaker is a hero to a lot of us, to a lot of young people who've been mobilized, have joined the left over the past few years. I think he represents honesty and decency in politics today. It is, of course, Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Corbyn is a member of parliament in the UK, a former leader of the Labour Party, and a former chair of Stop the War Coalition. He's also the founder of the Peace and Justice Project. Mr. Corbyn has inspired young people across the world for his principled positions on very difficult issues, including the issue of Palestine, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as his strong position against austerity economics that has been the economic orthodoxy for the past 40 years. So it is an honor for me to present to you Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
The war in Ukraine is disgusting and disgraceful, and we have to absolutely condemn the decision of the Russian government and President Putin to invade the Ukraine and take the lives of so many innocent people. Ukrainian, military and conscripted Russian soldiers are all dying in this awful conflict. The casualties of war are those that are killed. The casualties of war are the mental health that's left behind. The casualties of war are the bitterness that will go on for decades. And the casualties of war are the refugees that are now flowing out of Ukraine into neighbouring countries, particularly Poland. But there are also refugees from other conflicts around the world, from Yemen, from Libya, from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq. And we have to make it very clear that refugees of war deserve equal treatment wherever they come from by every government all around the world. And that is a position we've made very clear to the government here in Britain, and friends and peace campaigners around the world are making the same message elsewhere. All wars end with some form of negotiation and some form of settlement. Are we all going to be spectators in the horror of this conflict and wait until there's more killing, more destruction and more death before a peace negotiations begin? Or can there be a world call for peace? Because I'm alarmed at the increasingly hostile language that's being used by everybody. And if we think this conflict through, we have nuclear-armed states all around. We have nuclear weapons all around. Is this going to degenerate into the horror of the ultimate war in which there will never be any winners, only millions and millions of losers? Now is the time to make our voice heard. Ceasefire, negotiations, stop the conflict, and build for peace and respect for the future. Stop the conflict and build.
Thank you so much, Mr. Corbyn. It takes a lot of courage in these circumstances to take a principled anti-war position, particularly in the West, where there is a lot of euphoria for war and a lot of, it reminds me of 2001 and 2003, where we witnessed a form of almost like this European tribalism, where it was necessary for everyone to support wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and later in Libya and Yemen. But I think it gives us a lot of hope that we have people like Mr. Corbyn, who, despite this frenzy for war, this militarism that has been part of the West for at least the past 200 to 300 years, they have the ability to question it, to challenge it, and to be ambassadors of peace and solidarity in the West and around the world. Thank you, Mr. Corbyn, for inspiring us as always. And this brings us to our next speaker, who again is a very special guest. It's Saleh Ghaffar, who's a prominent activist for political and women's rights in Afghanistan, now living in exile following the return of the Taliban to Kabul. Previously, Saleh was the director of humanitarian assistance for the women and children of Afghanistan. I'd just like to add here that Afghanistan is not only facing the brutality of the Taliban regime, which is a particularly anti-women and anti-minority regime, but is also facing almost a Yemen-like situation in terms of famine, because their funds have been blocked by the US after its withdrawal. And I think it is time for the world to express solidarity with the Afghan people who are facing the twin evils of a fascist government at home and imperialist aggression from abroad. And people like Ms. Ghaffar are some of the bravest women today who are at the front lines of the struggles for democracy, human rights, and women's rights. So it's an honor for me to present to you Ms. Saleh Ghaffar.
Greetings to all freedom and peace-loving people in the world. I'm Sileh Ghafar from a war-ravaged country, Afghanistan. I'm from a generation of war. I was born in the war during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. One war bled into the next and the next. I grown up in war. Now I'm a mother of 2 kids. Whatever as a kid I had to experience, my children are experiencing the same. Well, I can say that today the United States and other Western powers are the main supporters of terrorism in the world. The current situation in Afghanistan, Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and other war-torn regions of the world is the result of this policy, and they always use this tactic for their hegemony and strategic purposes. At least after World War II, the US government proved that it had no gifts for other nations except bloodshed, destruction, looting, and oppression. Today, more than ever in the case of Afghanistan, it proves the veracity of this fact that the US invasion of Afghanistan had nothing to do with war on terror and destroying the terrorist sanctuaries or bring peace. The US, in contrast, used the Taliban as a pretext for occupying our war-ravaged homeland. And after 2 decades of killing the innocent people, which eventually pushed Afghanistan further into the terrorism and mafia trap, the US, under the name of so-called peace process, paved the way for them to return to power. It was of no importance for the US if the terrorists continued to shed the blood of innocent civilians. What matters for the US was to make a deal with the religious fascists that could give the US government a competitive edge over its economic and military rivals while keeping our country under its control with least cost. Well, similarly, I can see that the antagonism between the US with Russia over controlling Eastern Europe is the main cause of the war in Ukraine. And the common Ukrainians are obviously going to bear the brunt of the tragedy. Definitely, the US adds fuel to the fire of the ongoing conflicts all over the world and makes billions of dollars in profits from arms sales. So let's unite to see an end to the war in all parts of the world. We have the rights to have peace. I feel the importance of peace as I belong to a country that has always been at war, and our people have been victims of the evil policies of the imperialists for decades. The hands of the world vampires must be cut off from the destiny of the people all over the world, and they must be brought to justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sileh Ghafar. And as a Pakistani, as your neighbor, I would like to extend our solidarity and also acknowledge the negative role played by Pakistan in destabilizing governments in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And I really hope that the world recognizes the human catastrophe that is on the horizon, that's actually taking place right now in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, when the US moves away from a country, the global media loses interest in that country, but human lives continue to be wasted. Famine continues to threaten millions of families. And I think it's important that we do not follow the imperialist designs when it comes to which places deserve our sympathy or our attention, and keep our focus on the human tragedy that is unfolding in places like Afghanistan, in places like Yemen, and many other places which no longer have the attention of imperialism or of the global media. And with this, I come to our next speaker, who again is a very, very important and inspiring speaker for many of us. I'm talking about Professor Yanis Valufakis, who is the founding member of one of the founding members of the Progressive International and has been a very key figure in the global anti-austerity movement. Mr. Yanis Varoufakis is a member at the moment of the Hellenic Parliament and the Secretary General of MIRA 25. He's the co-founder of DM25 and the former finance minister of Greece. And I would just like to add that Mr. Varoufakis has been central in allowing many young people, many activists to imagine alternatives to the global capitalist order. And currently, I think the way he's working on the concept of techno-feudalism points to a dystopic future. And as he rightly points out, it's a future that we can and must prevent from actually taking place. So it's an honor for me to present to you Professor Yanis Varoufakis.
Hello, this is Yanis Varoufakis with a message on behalf of MIRA 25, a political party here in Greece, and DM25, our pan-European movement. A message to comrades participating in the Peace Forum of the Progressive International. These are very dire times, so you'll allow me a very personal message. When a country or a region is invaded, I feel as if I'm being overpowered by a duty to take the side of the people facing troops with direct orders to violate their homes, to bombard their neighborhoods, to destroy the circumstances of their existence, of their very life, and to do so without hesitation, unconditionally. When I see civilians in the Ukraine preparing Molotov cocktails by which to fend off the invaders, I cannot but cheer them on, independently of the history of Ukrainian politics, independently of how their government came about, independently of whether they actually like their government. Defending the right of Iraqis to defend themselves from advancing American troops back in 2003 had nothing to do with an acceptance of the vile Saddam Hussein, which brings me painfully to note the double standards of the West. On the one hand, a 15-year-old in Kalkidia throwing stones at advancing Israeli army bulldozers whose purpose is to demolish this kid's home, the West calls her or him a terrorist. But when Ukrainians throw Molotov cocktails, they're heroes. To help Ukrainians today, morally, in this struggle for existence effectively, we first need to demonstrate that we use the same moral compass, whether we are in Ukraine, Iraq, or Yemen. Only the other day, the Saudi Arabian Air Force bombarded Yemen 37 times in one day. To ignore the Yemeni victims of Western Saudi aggression is to diminish humanity's capacity to show solidarity with the Ukrainians and also our capacity to chastise Putin. Treating some victims of invasion as more deserving than others lessens our capacity to stand with any victims and all victims. To help Ukrainians find a path to peace and freedom, which is the number one priority, or should be the number one priority, we must also choose to put their interest above our fixations and ideologies. I am a left-winger, but while people in the Ukraine are dying, I do not have the right to focus on whether President Zelensky is a good Democrat, left-winger, his political biases, whether these are to my liking. It is irrelevant. Similarly, I hope that those who have completely different politics to mine, they may really like NATO and think that the European Union is the best thing that could happen to Ukraine, I hope that they put those predispositions very much lower on their list of priorities than the right of Ukrainians to live in freedom, peacefully and independently. So the only question that we need to ask ourselves now is this: how do we get the Russian troops to withdraw from the Ukraine? Any other question must wait. We know how Russian troops will not withdraw. We know that NATO is not going to come to the assistance of Ukrainian fighters. There won't even be a no-fly zone, despite Zelensky's requests. So how do we stop Putin from eventually occupying large parts of the Ukraine, with immeasurable medium and long-term costs for the Ukrainians, for the Russians, for Europe, for the world? There are only two possibilities: a diplomatic solution or regime change in Russia. Anybody who believes that the sanctions, the war, the continued campaign against the whole of the people of Russia, as if it is the fault of the people of Russia, as opposed to just Putin's and his regime. Anybody who believes that all this is going to bring about regime change and is banking on regime change to save the Ukrainians is placing the interest of the people of the Ukraine, and of course everybody else, very low in their list of priorities. A diplomatic solution is the only thing which is consistent with humanism, with rationality, and with peace. While this conflict is raging, we need to keep in mind what Putin is capable of. The more the brave Ukrainians are resisting Russian troops, the nearer we're getting to a Grozny-like vile outcome. Remember who Putin is. To solidify and stabilize his fledgling presidency back 20 years ago or so, he flattened Grozny. He turned it into Dresden. What's going to stop him from doing the same thing with Kiev? So this is not a theoretical question. It's a question of saving tens of thousands of lives with a diplomatic solution that the West, unfortunately, does not seem to be considering seriously with their fixation of the right of Ukraine to become a NATO member or a EU member. This is a theoretical right that has no bearing upon the reality of Ukrainians today. So what would an agreeable diplomatic solution look like? It would comprise three aspects. First, an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of Russian troops. Secondly, the opportunity for Putin to portray any deal, any agreement, as a kind of victory for him. And third, whatever agreement comes about must be jointly guaranteed by Moscow and the United States, by Washington. And to have any credibility and utility in the long term, it must involve a whole process of de-escalating tensions between NATO, Poland, the Baltics, the whole caboodle, and Russia. Is there a chance that Putin would agree to something like this? Absolutely. He's a ruthless killer, I have no doubt about that. But he's not mad and he's not stupid. He knows that his economy cannot sustain a long-term occupation of the Ukraine, nor can his military. He knows that the way in which his central bank was cut off from the international system of central banks, eventually this is going to bring his regime down. Maybe in 10 years, maybe in 15 years, but he knows it. So he would be interested in a deal that does two things, gives him a way out, and also allows him to go to his regime, to his oligarchs, and say, look, I stopped the eastward expansion of NATO, and I got the United States to grant Russia the respect that it deserves in the context of a summit between Biden and Putin. Now, of course, such an agreement would leave everybody slightly dissatisfied, but it would give the Ukrainians the chance to rebuild a free, democratic, and independent Ukraine. Many issues will need to be solved. For instance, the European Union can pour large quantities of money, if we care, as we say we do, about the Ukrainians, into rebuilding the Ukraine, well before there is any discussion about the Ukraine's accession to the European Union. At the same time, once Washington and Moscow jointly guarantee an agreement, you can have a demilitarized zone along the Ukrainian-Russian border, and the contested Donetsk and Luhansk regions could be administered along the lines of something like the Northern Irish Good Friday Agreement, which allows for a kind of joint sovereignty. Both Dublin and London are overseeing it with the European Union. A deal of that nature would be ideal even for this highly contested area between Russia and the Ukraine. Is this going to work? Who knows? What I do know is that the alternative is a long-term occupation, spelling in the long run, too long for the Ukrainians to benefit, major crisis in Russia that may, who knows, even yield somebody worse than Putin. The option of an independent yet neutral Ukraine, along the lines of Austria, Sweden, Finland, countries that managed to build free democratic societies because of their neutrality during the Cold War. That is a real option for the Ukraine today, possibly the only one. Anyone who places the theoretical right of the Ukrainians to join NATO and the EU really doesn't care about the Ukrainians. They care a lot more about NATO's image or the EU expansion. But is this the priority today? Comrades, friends, it is precisely at times like this, when the people of Europe are being railroaded into taking the side either of Putin or of NATO, that an organization like ours, the Progressive International, must break the deadlock and point to the only alternative, which is progressive internationalism, democracy, and yes, non-alignment with either the military-industrial complex of the United States, the CIA, and NATO, or with the brutish misanthrope, Vladimir Putin, who, having sat on the necks of his own people is now invading the people of Ukraine. Carpe diem.
Thank you, Yanis, for echoing what many of us, I think, have been feeling about the double standards in the narratives of war right now, whether that's support for sanctions that will undoubtedly, disproportionately affect the plight of normal people who did not choose this war in Russia, or, the narratives in the media and hunger for war and for no-fly zones and an escalation of this conflict that's going to shed the blood of young men and women and rip families apart. What we need, as you've rightly said, is very much a diplomacy of peoples. Our next speaker is someone who is engaged in this kind of struggle for many decades and at great personal cost. So I want to welcome, and I'm so honored that Ethugul could join us here today, Ethugul Kurchu, who's a PI council member and the current honorary president of the People's Democratic Party, the HDP, and honorary associate of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He spent 14 years as a prisoner between 1972 and 1986 for his political activism in Turkey, after which he successfully joined the United Bloc of Labour, Democracy and Freedom in 2011, which he successfully transformed into the HDP as we know it now. Unfortunately, he's now forced to live in exile, and that's where he's joining us from. Thank you for being here today at the group. The floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Ertuğrul Kurchu. I'm the honorary chair of the People's Democratic Party of Turkey, a joint party of Turkey's left with the Kurdish Liberation Movement. I'm also an honorary associate of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and I'm already in exile in Germany, and it's a pleasure to meet this forum to find a way out of this horrible war, and look forward for struggle for peace. On the 12th day of the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian army, human casualties have already passed 1,000. The beautiful and peaceful cities of Ukraine are ruined. More than 1 million women, children, and elderly had to flee their homes and peoples of Ukraine. This is a war fought on Ukrainian soil between NATO and Russia, the latter justifying its war purposes by rewriting Russian and Soviet history to claim parts of Ukrainian territory and reject its right to self-determination. On this occasion, I would like to express my condolences to the peoples of Ukraine who have lost their beloved ones in this insane and ruthless occupation, and to the mothers of the Russian soldiers who mourn for their martyrs without a cause, who are lost in others' war. In this war and in any war of an imperialist character, internationalists should stick to the principles what have passed the test of time in the two previous world wars, the Revolutionary Wars and Wars of National Liberation. The internationalist peace program should, without any reservation, condone the recognition of self-determination simultaneously with the repudiation of annexations. That is, the internationalists of every nation should demand the right of secession for the nations that are oppressed by their nations. This is the principal point for a democratic and lasting peace worldwide. Further, internationals should incessantly explain that the imperialist powers and the imperialist bourgeoisie cannot grant a democratic peace. Peace should be won by the collective and simultaneous action of the peoples, the first step of which is to detach themselves from the hollow patriotic verbalisms of their bourgeoisie and fight for their defeat. Hence, we should return to our proper roles. Russian internationalists are admirably fighting against Putin's great Russian chauvinism and imperialist schemes of reviving the Russian Empire, inevitably as a postmodern prison of nations. This compels us to play our parts as the ardent critics of the aggressive military pact of NATO and of the contribution by our own government in this war of domination with people's resources of the hypocritical justification of this unjust war. Turkey, a NATO member country with the biggest army and military-industrial complex, seconding that of the USA in the Atlantic Alliance, is the best example for imperial hypocrisy, both in terms of its own practices and of NATO's capacity of swallowing Ankara's infringements of the rights of its own Kurdish citizens and of the Kurdish citizens of Syria in Rojava and Iraq in Sinjar to self-determination. Ankara has already occupied and eventually depopulated Syria's Kurdish provinces of Afrin, Serekania, and Girasipi to deny self-rule to Syria's Kurds, and it continually bombs Sinjar to deny self-rule to Iraq's Yazidi Kurdish population under so-called security concerns, whereas it happily vocals its own part in the international chorus to denounce Russian expansionism in Ukraine. Turkey's government-controlled mainstream media turns video clips of Russian atrocities in Ukraine 7/24. However, the very Putin regime provides Erdogan the best role model for dealing with its own war resistors, express jailing and sentencing of the dissidents for high treason. Ankara, as part of the NATO alliance, sides with Ukraine in the ongoing conflict and supplies the Ukrainian army with the unmanned combat air vehicles and fans the flames of war with additional firepower, whereas herself is provided with the Russian S-400 mobile surface-to-air missile systems in turn for military cooperation in Syria against the Kurdish self-rule in Rojava. Ankara is maneuvering for obtaining the highest profit for minimum cost in this war of hypocrisies, keeping the military-industrial complex on track, keeping the Russian natural gas pipeline running, keeping the Ukrainian wheat exports uninterrupted, and preparing for new wars against Kurds with renewed consensus of its in-between role by the contending parties. We call on the peoples of Turkey for joining the campaign for Ankara's withdrawal from NATO and from similar existing and prospective military pacts and treaties for regional and global domination. We call on the peoples of Turkey urge Ankara stop arms sales and purchases to and from Ukraine and Russia. We call on peoples of Turkey urge Ankara withdraw its military presence from Syria, Iraq, and Cyprus. We call on peoples of Turkey to join forces for a reconstruction of the Republic of Turkey on the voluntary unity of peoples, on the recognition of self-determination of any constitutive entity down to the smallest village. We call on for an international front of peoples for peace to stop the war and to protect the globe from extinction by humans in human activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethugul, for bringing Turkey's ongoing and, in fact, escalating military occupation to our attention, as well as the clear complicity of actors like NATO in the ongoing conflict. As we think about self-determination that you spoke so passionately about, I want us to think about Rojava, which has, I know, been a source of hope for many of us because as an attempt to set up a democratic feminist society. I remember in one of our previous shows, journalist Debbie Bookchin had once said that what we're seeing in Rojava is a UN-sanctioned ethnic cleansing that's going on right before our eyes. And the reason for that, she was saying, is precisely because Rojava is the polar opposite of what's going on in vast parts of the world. And that's why it poses such a serious threat. So I'm really thrilled to invite our next speaker and our last speaker for today's forum, Ethugul Kurchu, who's a member of the Executive Council and spokesperson for the Commission on Foreign Relations of the Kurdistan National Congress, the KNK. Her current focus is the improvement of national dialogue amongst political parties and civil society organizations in Kurdistan. And she spent most of the period from 2013 to 18 in southern Kurdistan and Rojava, northeast Syria. Ethugul, you have the floor. Thank you so much for joining us today.
First of all, I would like to welcome the step taken by the Progressive International to raise the urgent need for peace by organizing this forum, the Forum for Peace. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we follow up that many of the progressive forces are passing a wrong direction by imposing on others to take side in this war. Sometimes we see that progressive forces are becoming anti-NATO pro-Russia or anti-Russia pro-NATO. From the Kurdish perspective, we reject to take part on one of the sides because we are looking from the third perspective, the perspective of the third power, the power of non-state actors, the power of grassroots, the power of women, the power of peoples. The war in Ukraine is like the war in Afghanistan, in Kurdistan, in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in Colombia, a result of the crisis of the capitalist system. The capitalist system is in a systemic, deep crisis. For it to survive, it will spread wars. If we, the progressive forces, wouldn't organize ourselves, then they will draw a very dark future for us. We need a shift in our perspective and not keeping ourselves busy but taking side. But instead, we should look how we can organize the grassroots everywhere. Networking, creating networks amongst the progressive forces to organize them to become a third power. As Kurds, we won't take side in this war. We won't be neither pro-Russia nor anti-America. Since we do believe Russia is not Soviet Union, is not a socialist state, since we don't believe that US will bring democracy. We experienced both powers in the last 10 years in Syria and have seen that both sides try to keep Turkey on their side because Russia's strategy was compromising with Turkey to weakening the NATO because Turkey is a key player in the NATO in Middle East. On the other hand, the US tried to keep Turkey as the main player of the NATO in the region. For that reason, Russia gave the Turkish regime green light in 2018 to occupy the Kurdish region of Afrin. A year later, the US gave Turkish regime green light to occupy two further Kurdish regions, the region of Serikani and Girisipi in 2019. So that's why we won't take side on neither for NATO or for Russia. For us, it's important to keep insistingly continuing our own agenda, organizing our grassroots. On the occasion of 8 March, we have experienced now in all 4 parts of Kurdistan, hundreds of thousands of women were saying we will overcome the key player of the NATO in our country, the Turkish fascism, the Turkish state's fascism. And in 3 weeks later time, in the Kurdish New Year celebration, Nevruz, we will again, Kurdish women and men, we will say we won't allow NATO to use Turkey to occupy our country. It is important to trust in people's power. For that, we need a shift in seeking ourselves, describing ourselves as a subject of politics, as a subject dynamic of transition of democratic future. We shouldn't expect that someone will offer us peace or a free life. We don't have any other options, any other alternatives than cooperating with each other. So the systematic crisis of the capitalist states is offering us this opportunity, since they are becoming much more militarist, more aggressive, and will continue to spread militarism and aggression all around the world. So this is the right time. We say this is the right time for freedom. And that means there's no way for us to cooperate, to coordinate with each other. And that's why I do believe discussing the need of peace amongst us is a first step. But we should continue day and night, insisting that we, as the people of the grassroots, the non-state actors, are one side, the third power, and we then will be able for self-determination. In this regard, I wish all of you all the best for the future.
Amar, I think you're on mute, if you could check.
Yes, thank you so much, Nilofer. You rightly pointed out that the crisis we see today is a crisis of global capitalism, of imperialism, and of a defaulting global system. And of course, many people like you, Kurds, especially women from Kurdistan, offer us an alternative possibility of being and belonging in the world today. With this, we conclude our Peace Forum. And I think there's certain things that have stood out for me that I'd like to point out. One is, of course, the clarity we've seen on the opposition to Russia's war in Ukraine. Also, I think it's very important that those who criticize NATO's expansionism are not indulging in whataboutery, but they are reflecting the lived experiences of those in the global south. As many speakers pointed out, there's a lot of suspicion among people in the global south of America's claim of being a defender of human rights and democracy, especially when America has been the primary sponsor of military regimes across the third world, and has also been viewed as a demolition squad in countries such as Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan. So it has become a symbol of terror for many, but even for us in Pakistan. Not only have we experienced military dictatorship supported by the US, but also overt and covert wars in our region without any vision for emancipation, freedom, or democracy. I would end by saying that there is a global order that we see today, which is in a state of crisis. As Gramsci would say, the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. And in the interim, there are monsters. So we are seeing all kinds of monsters emerging. But I think it also opens space for a new vision, a new politics, new institutions that can fill in the void that is being left by militarism and imperialism. And I think it is time that the global left comes together and debates what the future should be for reinvigorating a people's movement against the failing order that is letting us down, that is leading us towards environmental catastrophe, that is leading us towards wars, that is leading to the erasure of suffering of those in the global south. And I think Progressive International is a wonderful attempt to bring different voices together in order to present a coherent global alternative to the mess we see around the world. So I would welcome you all and also invite you all to join Progressive International and its affiliate organizations in order to begin the task of building a newer and better world. Over to Bersha to conclude the Peace Forum.
Thank you, Omar, for those powerful words. And the message from all of our speakers has been clear. It's to end the war in Ukraine. It's to end the war everywhere. And you're absolutely right about, to draw attention to the horrors of the war everywhere in the world is not a form of whataboutery. If anything, I think for me, it's a call that stems from real hope, because it's one that believes that we can extend the empathy that we're seeing, that we have for the Ukrainians, to the victims of other conflicts, wherever they might be. And one that refuses to be caught and to perpetuate binaries and be caught in the warring factions, as some commentary might want us to do. For us as internationalists, I think the sides are extremely clear. It's peace against war, it's open borders against fortresses, and it's solidarity against starvation. So if I could borrow Lenin's words, I remind myself, if there's ever a war slogan, it's this: it's peace to the hovels and war on the palaces. So thank you to all of our speakers who've brought us their testimonies from difficult places, both geographical and emotional. To Amar for being, a fantastic partner and chairing the first ever PI Peace Forum with me today. And to our audience who have joined us, I see in the comments from all around the world. Please continue to support us, and let's build a global anti-war movement together. Thank you.